And so that's what today is going to be all about. It's graphic design tips for non-graphic designers. And I'm concentrating on stuff that I think is really easy to learn how to use. That's great for our field specifically. And also is things that you can learn how to use pretty quickly so that you'll be able to see an immediate impact on your work. Just one side note before we get started. I always make resource websites for my talks, and I have one for this too. So it's going to include all of the techniques that I talk about, the resources that I talk about, some extra stuff that we just can't fit into a single hour. And I'm going to be giving you the link to that at the end of this talk. So if you miss taking notes or you don't want to take notes, don't worry, all that stuff is going to be there for you. Now, I'd love to get a bit of a level set of where all of you are at with your comfort level with visual design right this moment. So in the chat, I've got 4 options on the screen here. Which of the 4 do you think describes where you're at right now with your comfort level with visual design? Ooh, we got a lot of people who are pretty darn comfortable. Nice. Yeah, so not a lot of people who are like, I can't do any of this at all, but quite a few people who are like, I have some skills and I really want to just keep deepening them and building them. But yeah, regardless of where you're at, whether you're a 1 through or 3, I think there's going to be a lot here for you. If you're someone who's kind of at that 4 level, some of this is going to feel pretty familiar to you, but it might be helpful to help you coach other people on how to build their design skills, because this will give you some techniques that are really great for beginners. So I wanted to start this talk by talking about why I think design, and visual design in particular, is so important for clarity. And a good example of that is a story about something that happened to me several years ago at a hat making class that I took. So just for straight up fun, because I have weird hobbies, I decided I would take a hat making class and, just to learn some skills, not something I was ever going to do for a job. So I did some research and I looked for a class specifically for beginners. And I found one that you had to have some sewing experience, but you didn't ever have to have made hats before. And, it sounded like a good fit for me. So I went to the class and it became abundantly clear quite quickly that the instructor had never taught beginners before. And in fact, she straight up in the first class admitted she had never taught this class before either. And that became super clear when she handed us our first assignments, and the instructions looked kind of like this. Now, this is lorem ipsum placeholder text. It's obviously not the actual instructions to protect the guilty. But I'll be honest, the real instructions that we got weren't that much easier to understand than this fake Latin. So you might hope that each one of those paragraphs was an individual step in the process of a project. It was not. Different steps were clustered kind of randomly into paragraphs without any rhyme or reason to it. And this made it really hard to actually follow the instructions really well. And in some cases, me and my other classmates accidentally skipped some instructions or read them wrong. So we all went back to the instructor, because we were all having trouble with this, and asked for her to do something to make this easier to understand. And she made one really tiny design change, and it made a huge difference for us. She just numbered the steps. I mean, this does not require a graphic design degree. It probably took her all of maybe 5 minutes tops, but it made this huge difference in how we were able to follow the instructions and to learn how to do this. But what if she had gone even one step further? So if she had added even just a few more really simple, easy to use design elements, it would have been even easier for us to follow the instructions. And so I share this story not because I'm trying to instructional design shame. I could, that would be mean though. But because I wanted to share just how easy it can be to leverage very, very simple design techniques to make content easier for people to understand. And that's important with anything that people do, but it's especially important when you're in a role that's connected to learning or training. Because if there's anything that we can do to make things easier for our audience that we're designing for, to understand what we're trying to share and to learn it and use it later, we absolutely need to do that. Now, I'm going to kick it back to all of you. We're in a field where we're often asked to do visual design tasks, but without a lot of formal training in it. For all of you, what do you personally find difficult or tricky or barriers to leveraging visual design in your own work? Fonts. And don't worry, we're going to be talking all about fonts today. Photoshop's a tricky one. Unfortunately, we are not going to go into depth about Photoshop, but I am so glad to know that there are so many good resources like on YouTube and stuff like that for getting formatting. Cohesive look and feel is huge. Laying out the content, understanding what tools are available, consistency. Oh, Regina, consistency is my favorite thing, and we're going to talk about that consistently throughout this presentation. Draft interaction, fresh ideas. Yeah, fresh ideas is hard. Like, even if you're super competent with design, fresh ideas is a challenge. Design principles, sort of a disjointedness. Oh, Michelle mentions never liking her designs when they're complete. That hurts when you put a whole bunch of work into something and you get to the end and you're like, oh, I don't like what I made. I'm hoping that some of the stuff we're going to talk about today will help you out with that. Graphics to explain a concept. Andrea says you're not creative. Andrea, I bet you are creative. I'm going to say a thing. I used to be an art teacher, and I had to give this speech a lot, that there's a real difference between art skills and creativity. And so art skills are, your fine art skills, drawing, painting, what have you. Not everyone's super great at that. It takes a lot of practice. But creativity is just about finding new connections between things, coming up with new ideas, finding new solutions. I think if you work in learning and training, we're all doing that on a regular basis, just maybe not for visuals. And so some of what we'll talk about today is how you can start using that creative problem solving for visual design. So yeah, lots of really great things. And these are all really legitimate barriers. They are hard things to overcome when you're a trained designer. They're even harder when you're someone who's like an instructional designer who's just been told, okay, make a PowerPoint and make it attractive, or make this really great e-learning or this really great ebook, and you've never had design training before. And so you might be thinking to yourself, all this design stuff sounds really great, Bianca, but I am not a trained graphic designer. And like with my example, there are a lot of opportunities to leverage simple visual design, stuff that's super easy to learn how to use in thoughtful ways without needing to go get a master's in graphic design. That's a valuable thing to have, but not everyone wants to be a graphic designer. And that's okay. We sadly can only learn how to do so many things. But what I do think is important is that people in our field get a good enough baseline knowledge with visual design that when we need to do things ourselves, we know how to do things in a way that we're comfortable with and that we think makes things easier for our audience, increases clarity. That's what we're going to do today. I've picked out a whole bunch of techniques that I think are really good baseline skills. They're things that are incredibly easy to learn how to use. They're practical things that you can use right away. We're going to kind of skip theory and go right to practical use. And they're things that I find make a really quick impact so you can immediately see a difference in your work. I am going to be showing you a bunch of sort of basic techniques that you'll probably have seen trained designers, the advice is things that they break every so often or bend. And it's not that I'm opposed to taking risks in design, but I think when you're getting started or you're just like building your confidence with design, that it's helpful to know what some of the basics that kind of work all the time are. And then as you build more confidence, then you can start thinking about how do I play with the rules or even break them in ways that are interesting. And I've broken down today into these 4 topics. We're going to look at some general advice, and then as promised, we're going to go into fonts or typefaces. We're going to look at graphics, and then we're going to finish up by talking about how you lay out everything in whatever you're designing. And so first, the general advice. These are a few little tips that I find are great for thinking about at the beginning of any visual design aspect of a project, or I'm going to be honest, any kind of project whatsoever, even if you're not thinking about visual design right away. So first up, it is incredibly important to consider who your audience is, because what makes great design for one group of people or one audience might not be as great a design for another. Think about if you're designing an instruction manual for experts. And what they want is to really like dive in deep to the content. They want to be able to flip to what they need right away and not have to fuss with anything. They don't need a lot of hand holding. They're super competent. You can even write for an expert. You can assume they have some base knowledge going in. But a design for that same kind of instruction manual, but for beginners, that kind of design is going to be overwhelming. So you'll want to strip out some of your content. You might want to add in images and illustrations. You might want to space things out a lot more so they're not overwhelmed and you're kind of avoiding cognitive overload. So just let the preferences and needs of your particular audience guide your design decisions. And then next up, you really also want to think about the medium or mediums people are going to be interacting and viewing your content on. Because like what looks really good as a blown up poster on a wall in a classroom might look kind of crummy on, let's say, your smartphone. And so you want to really think about how each medium has its own unique strengths and weaknesses and play to them. So play up the things in that medium that are its pros and mitigate the cons. Then consistency. I am going to talk about consistency a lot today because consistency does a lot to make all of your work look like it goes together, but it also makes things a lot easier for your audience because people are looking for patterns in whatever you create. So like if you make the titles on the first page in an ebook, one color and a font, and they're consistently like that until about halfway through the ebook, and then they change randomly. That's confusing for people. And as much as it's just a little thing, inconsistency is going to cause people to stop and ponder, why is that different from what I expect? That puts up barriers. So what I recommend for helping your audience and also for making your life a little easier is just make consistent design choices throughout whatever you're designing. All right, so let's move on to one of the first things that you're going to see when you start actually getting into the nitty-gritty of the design, the lettering that you use, your typefaces. So a typeface, you might be more used to calling them fonts. From a graphic design perspective, these are technically slightly different terms. For the sake of the conversation we're going to have today, feel free to use them interchangeably. No one here is going to be fussed. So a typeface or a font is just a set of characters that all have similar design choices and aspects that you use for words and things like that. So I've got 7 different typefaces on the screen here. An important thing to know about typefaces when you're deciding how to use them is that they have their own unique aesthetics, their look and feel. So like Century Gothic up there at the top it has got these very slender lines. It looks very sophisticated. Cooper Black right below it, it's got rounded lines. It's kind of chubby. That makes it look really friendly. Very, very different from Country Gothic. And oh, Emily, you mentioned Comic Sans. We're going to talk about Comic Sans later. I promise. And then if you look farther down, American Typewriter is an interesting one because it looks like the characters you would get from a typewriter. So it has this retro feel. What you want to do when you're choosing typefaces, if you have an opportunity to choose ones you're using, is use ones where the aesthetic and the look and feel reinforces the overall aesthetic you want your project to have, because a mismatch of that is going to feel weird to people. And Zoom seems to have frozen for me. Just give me a sec. I'm just going to get the slide deck working again. Sorry, everyone. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for just a second. Oh, no, I think we got it back. And I'm just gonna get this all set back up for you.
I think I'll just jump in and remind everyone that we are recording the video, and we'll be sharing the video later.
Yeah, unfortunately, The Zoom just froze, but we can fix that pretty quickly. All right, and so hopefully everyone can see the screen. And yeah, we'll get back to this. So what I sometimes see happen when people try and get more into using different typefaces is we get something that looks kind of like this, where it's chaotic. There's a lot of different typefaces used in ways that just don't seem to make sense. It's really hard to read, and this is going to get in the way of people understanding your content, and it kind of looks unprofessional. But this is super easy to fix with a couple of things that I'm just going to talk about now. Now, first, I want to show you an example on the next screen. It's a lot less chaotic than the one we just looked at, but it does have one thing with regards to the typeface that I think makes it a bit tricky to skim. So, in the chat, what do you think is something that you think makes this a little harder to skim when it comes to just thinking about the typeface? Because obviously, yeah, Latin is hard, especially fake Latin. Yeah, and I'm seeing a couple people who are, I mean, there's like a few really good points in here too, but a couple people are touching on a really good point, which is what I wanted to show with this. Some people have said size, nothing stands out, no styling, bingo. This, if you look really carefully, you can sort of from the spacing see some things that might be subheaders or headers, but it's really not clear because all the typeface here is the exact same size. Size is a really good way to organize content and make it clear to someone just at a glance what different kinds of things are. So size with typeface is obviously it's measured in points, and the thing to keep in mind is, you know, the larger something is, the more people are going to see it as important and look at it right away, and vice versa. So you can leverage size differences to help visually organize your content. So obviously, you would not design a slide like this. Please don't make slides that look like this, but let's say this was an ebook. You know, there'd be an appropriate amount of text. What I've done here is I've made the subtitles a bit larger and then the titles quite a bit larger. And now you can just quickly skim this and go, okay, I understand what content is where, and that's just one small design thing that can make a huge difference in how people interpret your work and how quickly they can interpret it. Two things to keep in mind when you're leveraging size. Once again, consistency. You want to make sure that if you're making a choice with size in one section of your design, that you're making that choice consistently throughout. So, you know, if your titles are 24 point on one screen, keep them that way for the rest. The other thing to keep in mind is if you're leveraging size, you really want to make sure it's immediately apparent to the eye that there's a size difference. So if you use 12 point typeface for your body, I guess like the vast majority of your text, and then 14 point for your headings, it's not a huge size difference, and in fact some people won't even notice it right away, so it's not helping you. You want a larger size difference so people can see. Now, another thing you can do to visually organize your content is leverage typeface line weight. And so a line weight is just the width of your the lines that make up the typeface. And a lot of professional typefaces will come in multiple line weights. So you see this is 5 different line weights of a typeface called DAX. And if you look at the characters, they're designed the same way, it's just with thicker or thinner lines. And so you can use multiple line weights together in a design and have it still look really cohesive and like it all belongs together. Same rules as size. You want to make sure first that you're using line weight consistently throughout your design, and then also make sure that the differences are apparent. Like I probably wouldn't use DAX light with DAX regular because at a glance it's not quickly apparent that there's a different line weight, but I might use DAX light with DAX bold. All right, so when you're thinking about using different typefaces together, it can be really handy to know about typeface structure types, because graphic designers will organize different typefaces into different sort of like similar families, which helps them make good decisions about which ones to use together and which ones maybe you shouldn't use together. There are a lot of these families, but when you're getting started, I think really you only need to start by knowing how to identify 3 different types. Obviously, when you get more skilled with design, you can go deeper on that. But for making like easy, good decisions right away, these 3 are all you need. Your first group is your serif typefaces. So serif typefaces are very simple, easy to read designs. And one thing that sticks out that'll help you recognize them is they've got these little end caps on the end of the letter lines, which are called serifs. Historically, serif typefaces have been considered much easier to read in print format. This is one of those things, though, I recommend taking that advice with a bit of a grain of salt. It's often repeated design advice that I have actually never seen significant repeated studies back up. So it's design advice. It may or may not be true depending on the situation. But a thing to know, because you'll hear it a lot. All right, so our second structure type is sans serif, and it is very similar to the serifs. It's very simple character design, very readable. The only serious difference is it doesn't have those end caps. And if any of you have ever taken French, you probably figured that one out ahead of time. All right, finally, this is the one that is not a graphic design term. This is my catch-all bucket for everything else. What we're just going to call today fancy. So it's your typefaces that look like handwritten script, ones that are incredibly decorative with a lot of detail. These typefaces have a lot of aesthetic personality, but all of that detail makes them very hard to read in large blocks of text. So I recommend avoiding them for large blocks of text. You know, you might use them for just a little bit of text like a logo or in a layout to make something stand out. But generally speaking, these aren't super readable. When people try and mix different typefaces together in a design, there are 2 polar opposites that either one can be a problem. If you use typefaces that are extremely different from each other, like the ones on the left of the screen here, it looks really chaotic. There's nothing tying them together, and it all looks kind of random. But on the right, you can see the opposite problem. If all the typefaces you've chosen look incredibly similar, it's hard to see the differences between them. Like right there, you've got 4 different sans serif typefaces. They all look mostly the same with some slight differences, but you can't immediately tell what they are, which is just going to look kind of wonky. So here's a pairing that I think works really well almost every single time. Choose one serif typeface, one sans serif typeface, use one for your headers, use the other one for your body text. You're good to go. That will almost always work quite well. Another option you can do is just choose one typeface. It is not going to make your design look, unprofessional. There are a lot of professional visual designers who will often use just one typeface. I mean, sometimes they'll play with line weight, but it can be a really good option. Here comes Comic Sans, Emily. So there are 2 kinds of typeface groups that I think we need to be careful about using. The first are typefaces that we've seen over and over and over again. So your Times New Roman, Arial, things like that were defaults on software. People have seen them so much that they're going to appear tired to them, and that could carry over to our work and how people perceive it as well, which is not great. The other group is ones that have been deemed by the design community as not particularly attractive or not particularly well designed. Comic Sans is the big elephant in the room here with that. Generally speaking, audiences are going to perceive these as just not as attractive, and that feeling is probably going to go onto any design that you use them for. Someone mentioned, Pilar said something that Comic Sans might be useful for certain audiences. I think there are ways to find typefaces that look kind of like that, that can feel approachable. There's some really good comic hand lettering ones that I think are fantastic and you can get for free that are a bit better designed than Comic Sans. And so you can leverage that same friendly aesthetic with a typeface that's a bit better designed. And yeah, Jenny, Arial is your mandated organization typeface. That's why I said when you can choose, because I know a lot of us will end up in situations where we don't have a choice a better typeface. And as much as Arial is a bit tired because it's a mandatory typeface of a lot of organizations, at least it is quite readable. So that's a plus. Whoever is running is logged in as ATD Cascadia mentions alternative typefaces like Rubato are similar to Comic Sans, but a bit less, or similar, not to Comic Sans, but a bit less tired than some of the other options. And so, Chris, you mentioned accessibility concerns. That you've always heard that it's hard to use sans serif for readability. So that can depend on the technology you're using, as well as the typeface itself. Because as much as it's nice to say, well, serifs or sans serifs are substantially readable or not, it varies. One of the things, this is why the design community always used to say serifs are easier, is that those little end cap serifs lead the eye into the next character. This is something that I've never really seen research back up, though. So as long as you're looking at the typeface and it is very clear at the size that you need it to be shown at, an eye test is probably going to help you more so than going, I'm never going to use sans serif or I'm never going to use serif. Really, as long as you're staying away from those fancier, more ornate fonts, and you're putting your typeface at a size that is quite readable, either one, in most cases, will be fine. But that does lead me to something that I wanted to say about Comic Sans, because as much as it is considered poorly designed from an aesthetic perspective, and not that handwritten fonts can't look good, it's just there's certain things about these characters that aren't well proportioned. There is something it's legitimately, weirdly, and accidentally good for. It turns out that some people with dyslexia find Comic Sans an easier typeface to read. It's not because of how it was designed purposefully. This is a pure accident. But there's something in the way that the individual characters that tend to flip for people are written that you can still tell which one is which, even if it's flipped. So there are specific typefaces out there that have been designed specifically for some of the challenges with dyslexia, but those typefaces are not on every single computer, and Comic Sans is. So surprisingly, it actually can be a really great accessibility tool for some people. Once again, not everyone who has dyslexia feels that this font works for them, but some do. So, I like ragging on Comic Sans sometimes, but if it happens to be a really great accessibility tool, that's something to celebrate. If anyone wants some alternative to Comic Sans that has that friendly feel, but maybe isn't in Comic Sans, please hit me up. I have a ton of really good suggestions for you that are all free fonts that you can leverage. And yeah, Phil brings up a point. Serifs can feel old-fashioned. And that's some of that aesthetic that I was talking about earlier is serif typefaces skew a little bit older. They can look a little more formal. That's a thing you can play up because there's some that feel very sophisticated and well-grounded, but don't feel terribly old-fashioned, but they're never probably going to feel as modern as a serif typeface. So, use that where you need. Oh, and Phil remembers Becky remembers screen beans. Yeah. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the other big visual side of graphic design, which are the graphics that you choose to use. Jenny, I'm so sorry that you do not know what screen beans are. I'm sad that I'm actually going to have to tell you. I will show you some examples. It's a kind of clip art, and it's the worst. Speaking of the worst, this is what we're trying to avoid. And for those of you who are asking what screen beans are, the little clip art dudes in the top corners and the bottom right-hand corners, those are all examples of a clip art set from the 90s called screen beans. And I do not miss these. They haven't been involved in Microsoft Office for a very, very long time, but they used to come prepackaged and standard. It was the worst. So yeah, we're trying to avoid things like this, where we've got dated graphics, some kind of questionable clip art, stuff that doesn't seem like tonally it goes together. Some of these images are very small. We've got some color issues here. One, the colors are kind of chaotic. We also have colors that make it very hard to read. Red text on a green background. Yeah, don't do that. And, yellow on top of white, also really hard to read. Now, I would love to tell you that I do not see people regularly creating things for e-learning or like slide decks or other things like this. That would be a lie. But I promise you, it is very easy once you know a few design tips to avoid designs that look like this. Now, graphics are an area that even if you don't have a graphic design background, a lot of us are still very sensitive when things just kind of rub us the wrong way from a design perspective. So in the chat, if you have any examples of times where you've seen bad graphics, either in your personal life or your professional life, let us know what, examples of when that's happened to you. And if you happen to remember, what specifically rubbed you the wrong way about the graphics? Oh, and Spriddle says, did my mom give you that slide? Oh, it looks like her first PowerPoint slide she made me, and she was so excited. Yeah, and you don't want to like rain on someone's parade and be like, your slide is the worst. You want to encourage someone, but yeah, that's not. We would also want to encourage them to continue to grow as a PowerPoint slide designer. Yeah, Jim McKinnon says they're very distracted when graphics aren't well aligned with text. That's a really simple thing that kind of, even if you don't have a design background, you go, that feels a little jarring. Oh, anything with animated GIFs. Yeah, I love a good GIF, but you got to be careful with that. Overly generic combo of clip art and photos. Yeah, there's a cognitive dissonance when you have clip art and photos together. You have to be really careful about doing that. Oh, A. Browning mentions a flyer they had seen. Flyers put up around a neighborhood, like especially, we're having a bake sale or a garage sale. Yeah. I mean, you appreciate the effort, but sometimes they're not always the best designed. Meaningless images and graphics. Oh, that's a hot button one for me. I do not care for those. We will talk about that later. Watching negative space. Oh, Spurtle. Yes, negative space is huge. Menus. Yeah, menus that are poorly done. Oh, well, Michelle, that is a unique challenge, struggling to try and create rolling hills that don't look like memories. You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, I can't unsee it. Yeah, and Regina brings up cultural references that many wouldn't understand. That's a thing to think about when you're thinking about your unique audience that you're designing for. Event posters that are so busy you can't figure out, okay, well, where, when, what is the event? Yeah, that's when your design's really getting in the way of the purpose of the document. Yeah, we have all seen some stuff. Oh, Trevor mentions overused stock images. Yeah, that is legitimately a challenge, and it's one that we're going to talk about in a little bit too. So something that I think is a really easy way to start tidying up your graphics is to think carefully about how you use color. Because like we saw in that example, random colors or colors that don't go together well, they are very distracting. And so an easy way to clean that up is to leverage a color palette. So a color palette is a small amount of colors that you use consistently throughout a design, and all those colors go together. So what you've got on the screen right now is the color palette that I used for this presentation. And when you're thinking about putting together a color palette, some people are really amazing at picking out colors and having them go together. If that is not you, here are some suggestions for ways to get started. So you can look for inspiration from things around you that have been well designed. I mentioned physical items, but this can also be digital items as well. So if you work for an organization that has an official logo or might even have official colors, you can pull colors from there to have something feel really on brand. If you're not as worried about being on brand or that it's just not right for the project you're working on, look around you at things that you find well designed. So when I was pondering what colors I might want to use for this project, something that started my inspiration was a skirt that I had where I really liked the bright, super saturated colors. Now, obviously, I didn't use the exact same colors from my skirt because that's a photo of it, slightly different, but it did get me going down a path of inspiration. So look around you, look at magazines that you like, photos, a t-shirt you think is really great, an ad you think, has some colors that pop, a cereal box you think really catches your eye, anything. Laura asks, notice that I have 5 colors. Is 5 the magic number? Not exactly. I mean, 5's a really good place to start because you don't want too many, but you can go lower, you can go a little bit higher, depending on the situation. But if you're just getting started, 5 or 6 is what you'll see in a lot of examples. That can be a good place to start. I'm going to give recommendations, but I very rarely think anything there's a hard, fast rule of it always has to be blank. So I'm going to be sharing stuff like, try this. And then when you get comfortable, play around with it a little bit. Yeah, and Becky mentions a book that showed colors that go together and their RGB and CYMK values. And so RGB and CYMK are two kinds of ways of identifying color. One's for print and the other one is for digital. And that's actually a nice tie-in to some of the other things that I'm going to show you. Thank you for the segue, Becky. You have to remember borrowing color schemes from toys. Toys have great color schemes. Yeah, so something that I really like for inspiration are pre-created palettes. So there are graphic designers out there that just for funsies make color palettes and share them for free. So the example that I have on the screen here is from a website called Design Seeds. And yes, there's a link to that on the resource website, don't worry. And I don't know if it's one designer or multiple designers, but what they do is they take an inspiration photo, like the one on the screen here is really pretty. They pull out what they see as the dominant colors and build a color palette around that. So as you can see, this one has 6 colors in the color palette. Still works really well. And so you can go to that website or other websites like this and browse them. Pinterest is another really good one for just finding people who have posted color palettes. It's pretty cool. Now, another thing you can check out are palette generator websites. And so I've seen 2 different variations on how these function. One of them is you find an image or a photograph that you think has some colors you think are cool, and then you upload it to the website. And it uses algorithms to pull out what some of the dominant colors are, and they'll build different color palettes for you based on the photograph. Then there are other sites like this where you skip the photograph or image uploading thing altogether, and they'll just randomly generate palettes for you, just based on algorithms and knowing what colors do and don't go together. And once again, I've got tons of links to those in the resource website. And once you've gone through those, if you want more, Google will help you find more. I find new ones of these all the time. So Michelle asks what color I would use for my fonts with these pre-designed palettes, and that's going to depend. Some of this is the limitations of what you're trying to work in. Like you've got a lot of text where someone's reading. It is hard to read like a really light text on a light background. Ideally, what you want is contrast more than anything else between the background and the text itself. So you have a light background, you want a dark color, and vice versa. So what color that dark color is, it can vary. I tend to go towards charcoal, not a full-on black, but that's my aesthetic choices. But you could go for a dark purple, a dark blue. You could go full-on black, just as long as there's good contrast. All right, so now we need to think about images, because I know some of us talked about images in that list of things we had seen that were not so attractive. Because you want to be thoughtful about the images you choose. Not every image is good. And there are a number of ways that an image can be of lower quality. So first up, there's the quality of the image file itself. So if you have a smaller image file and you blow it up to a really large size, at some point it's going to start getting blurry. And we never want to use blurry images. It's the clearest sign that something has not been well designed. So if you have an image you want to use and it's gotten blurry at the size you need it to be, either find a higher quality version of that same image or replace it with one that is crisp at the size that you need it to be. And Phil's trying to get us hungry. He's talking about color combinations that make people ravenous. And Regina, yeah, Regina mentioned color at adobe.com. That's a really good resource for color generator. All right, so another way that an image can be low quality is if you have to distort the image to make it fit where you want it to fit. So in this case, I've squished it to make him fit. The guy looks like I've stretched him out like a piece of taffy. It's not good looking, it doesn't look professional. In a case like this, what I recommend is either crop the image to make it fit the area you need it to be in, or once again, if you crop it and still really isn't working, replace the image entirely. Then there's the quality of how well it connects to your topic, because you don't, like we were saying earlier, want to just use an image to use an image. It should reinforce your topic or theme, or even better, contribute something to it. I love images, do not get me wrong, but I would rather not have any images at all than use an image that doesn't connect to my messaging. And so some images are better at connecting to messaging than others. This particular image is one that I found in the Microsoft stock photos resource that they discontinued ages ago. And I was looking for a question mark, and this came up. And I was like, why on earth would anyone need a meet question mark? Like, that's just, in a lot of cases, that's going to be a massive distractor. But yeah, it was funny. So I shared this with some people I worked with, and months later, someone came to me, and they had a printed, it was a magazine from their like Costco or Sam's Club or something like that, that was talking about questions that people have about meat safety and like from a health perspective. And I went, oh yeah, I guess that tonally would work. But otherwise, the meat question mark is weird. Yeah, Ruth Clark has, yeah, definitely check this out. When images don't support the content, they actually detract from what's going on, and that can impact how well people learn in a bad way. And yeah, that plate is, yes. Nothing about this image really makes me want to eat that steak. I have questions about how tasty it would be and how safe it would be to eat. So then finally, and this is another thing that came up when you guys were talking about things you'd seen that were kind of awful. An image loses quality when you've seen it too many times. So there's good old screen beans here that have been around since the 90s, and tons of people were using them, and they've been seen over and over again. They're tired. So you don't want to use sort of generic images or images that are kind of trite, like the two hands shaking in front of a globe. Yep, it's trite, it's played out. But even the most beautiful image, if you use it over and over and over again, it's going to come across as tired to your audience. So if you are going to be reusing images that you keep in like your own organization stock photo library, just be cognizant of how much the audience that you're showing them to has seen them in other projects. There's also the number of images that you choose to use. And you know, what I'll see people who aren't super confident about design do is they'll put a whole bunch of images on the screen. They don't necessarily go together, and you don't necessarily need that many. So it just kind of ends up being a little distracting. Not to say that you can't ever need multiple images, but I'm talking about situations where you really don't. And what I tend to find works better is choose one really good image and just leave it at that. And if you're looking for examples of this done right, look to advertisements and magazine layouts. And so Emily asks about logos on every slide. Oh, please. So I can't remember. There's two people who I really love in presentation design, Gar Reynolds and Nancy Duarte, and I cannot remember which of the two said this, but they said when it comes to the logo on every slide or logo on every PowerPoint slide, it's not like people are going to forget where they work or where you work if you're doing a presentation. I don't believe it's necessary. I think it takes up space and is a distractor. It is something that you will often get pushback on if you try and remove logos from every screen, but talking about the thing like the Ruth Clark, images that don't support the content suppress the learning, it can be a way to kind of ease people off a logo on every slide. Also showing examples of how clean and crisp it looks and also how much extra space you gain on the slide can be a way to kind of push back on that. It's legit a battle though. Another thing that I think I see people struggle with when they're starting to get used to putting together designs is how big should the images be? And so you'll see these little itty bitty images and they're very small and they don't take up a lot of space. But if you've got a really good image, you should let it take up space so that people can really take it in, particularly if it's adding context or content to your work. So going a bit bigger, as long as you've got a great image, works really well. And once again, look to magazine ads and magazine layouts for examples of this done right. Where do you get photos? If you've now hopefully bought into the idea that photos, graphics, illustrations, you want good ones. One place to start is stock photo sites. I'm relatively certain most, if not all of us, have used these before. If you've got a bit of a budget, this can be a good way to get high quality photos at a cheaper price than it would be to hire a professional photographer to take custom ones for you. They are really nifty in how you can search them now too, because you can enter some keywords for search parameters, but you can also tell it, do you want people in them or not? Do you want multiple people? How many people? What colors do you want as dominant colors? What kind of a layout do you want? So the search functionality is really fantastic. Just keep in mind, obviously you're not the only one using stock photo sites. So you want to be thoughtful about, have I ever seen this photo used somewhere else before, particularly if it's used in a context that is drastically different from where you want to use it. And then one thing that I sometimes do with stock photo sites when I've got a lot of pages of search results is I'll actually skip the first few pages and go to like page 4 or 5 of the search results, because chances are most people just like hit the first image they liked and kept, and left. So that can be a good way to get some stock photos that aren't as overused. All right, if you do not have a budget, then what I recommend are options for free photos. So not using Google image search and using whatever, because you will not have license to use most of those images, and we really want to respect copyright. But these are free photo sites where you are licensed to use them without having to pay anything. So sites like Pexels and things like that are really good for high quality images. And I've got a ton of good options for free photo sites on the Resource site for this. Creative Commons is another thing that you're going to want to know about if you're functioning on a budget. This is a licensing format for people who want to let people use something they've created for free, but put some limitations on how it's used. So more often than not, the limitation with Creative Commons is that you need to credit the author. And yeah, so anytime you want to use a Creative Commons licensed item, just look at the specific Creative Commons license, because there's a few different licenses and you just want to know how to follow the rules with it. And then there is other sources for free design elements, like the Articulate Community, eLearning Heroes is great. I tend to find stuff on Twitter all the time. I actually put together a Pinterest board because I just keep bumping into free stuff, and it's just a really great way to just tuck it all away until I need it. There's a link to that in the Resource site, and honestly, create your own Pinterest board when you bump into things. It's pretty awesome. And we got some people in the chat sharing their own resources. That was actually, you guys are one step ahead of me, because I was going to ask what image for sites do you recommend? So if you want to throw any others in there. But finally, if you can't find the images you need, consider making your own. You've got a lot of really fantastic tools in your pocket. Your phone smartphones are really fantastic for creating photos these days, and some good apps for helping you just tidy them up too. And PowerPoint. I've got some tutorials on the Resource page that'll help you leverage PowerPoint to create icons that you can actually use elsewhere. And Christine asks where on Twitter. I think I've got some people on the Resource site that I recommend following because they tend to share stuff on Twitter. I will give you my Twitter account at the end of this too, because I regularly share free stuff and share people who share free stuff. So next, let's talk about layout. Like once you have all these design elements, where do you put them? And how do you put them in a way that looks good? So something to leverage is grouping, because when things are closer together or farther apart, people perceive them as more or less related. So you can use that to help kind of organize things visually. So in this case, I don't have any kind of visual grouping here, but I can change that up pretty fast. So you can see I've made little blocks of text separate and then closer to those teal rectangles. That makes them look related. Those two groupings at the top are closer together than the one that's farther away. That's going to make those first two seem more related, and the one at the bottom a little less. Then we're talking about white space. So white space is the empty space in a design, and it is really important for helping people process each item individually and avoiding cognitive overload. And when you don't have a lot of white space, you get something like this, where everything looks really crammed in. It's very hard to take in each thing individually, and it feels very overwhelming. This is very hard to learn from, and it's something that can cause people to disengage from your design. But just adding in a bit more white space, some empty space in between everything, it makes it easier to take in individual elements. It feels less overwhelming. People will engage with it more. You will notice, though, that I had to move some stuff off screen in order to buy myself that white space. And in a lot of cases, you're better off having slightly longer screens or more pages or more slides that have that white space that keep people from feeling overwhelmed than you are to try and cram that same amount of information in less slides or screens. I think someone else earlier mentioned slides are free. Yes, yes they are. This is one we sometimes have some challenge with in our field where people kind of want to do a content dump and want to shove as much on screen to avoid screen counts or like page counts. But really, a few extra pages, if they're really well laid out, most people don't mind. Alignment is another thing that came up, and alignment is just how things are lined up with each other. And when there's not a lot of alignment, things look kind of chaotic, thrown on the screen, like we've got here. And this is really simple to fix. It's a very, very small thing. It's going to make everything look tidier. In this case, I've just lined everything up on the left, and all of a sudden, everything looks more pulled together. Alignment is really easy to do now because a lot of software will automatically tell you when things are lined up as you're moving them around. That's awesome. A lot of software also has automatic alignment buttons where you select a few things, hit align like left or something like that, and now it's really quick and easy to do. Right, now if you're thinking about looking at a blank page or screen and you're not sure how to even start laying things out, I recommend starting with a grid. So what you do is you break up your page or your screen into an even grid. In this case, I'm using a 3x4 grid. This is super easy to use, very flexible. And then you just start taking your design elements and put them in one or more squares of the grid. And so you're going to fill those out. It helps keep you having too much or too little on your screen. Take away the grid, and it looks really tidy without a lot of work. All right, so those are our basics. But in our last few minutes together, I wanted to give you some additional resources because at some point you're going to get all these basics down pat. So I wanted you to have a few things to help you continue to build your skills afterwards. So for general advice, a book I really recommend is White Space is Not Your Enemy. So it goes into a lot of the topics that we talked about today, but in even more detail. But it's written for people who are newer to graphic design, so it's very accessible, very easy to understand. For typeface, I have two really fun little mini games to try out. The first one is called I Shot the Serif because someone was feeling punny. And it is a game that helps you quickly identify the difference between serif and sans serif typefaces. So there's a whole bunch of letters on the screen, all in different typefaces, and you, as fast as possible, need to click or shoot just the serif typefaces. It's silly, but it's fun. And if you're looking at how do you mix up using different typefaces together when you want to get a little more complex with that, this game, Type Connection, is neat for giving you some coaching on that. Because in it, you basically you choose a typeface, you get to know a little bit about its personality, and then it gives you 5 other typefaces that you can match it with. And it's neat because whether you make a good choice or a not so great choice, it gives you a lot of coaching about why those typefaces either do or don't work well together. For graphics, I'm actually going to recommend a book that is not a graphics book. This is Presentation Zen by Gar Reynolds, who I mentioned earlier. He's a really well-known person in the presentation design space. And this book, while it's a book on presentation design, the information in it about graphics, it's good just in general about graphics, but I think it's really good from an information design and information sharing perspective on graphics, because presentation design and like instructional design and training design have a lot of overlap. So a lot of what he says about graphics translates very well to the specific needs of our world to share information. For layout, this is a tiny corner of a much larger graphic called the very creative 892 Unique Ways to Partition a 3x4 Grid, which is a mouthful. But I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's much larger. And there are literally that many ways to partition this kind of grid. So I used to like having the larger version of this printed up, and I'd have it on the side of my desk. And anytime I was stumped about how to start thinking about a layout, I'd just kind of glance over and look for ideas. I'm going to skip this because we're right at the end. What I am hoping that you got from today's session is a feeling that this is something that you can take on, that you can feel comfortable taking on design tasks, and that even some of the little small things that I recommended today can make a big impact on the clarity of the designs that you create. So as promised, what you're seeing on the screen right now is a web link to the resource page that I created for this talk. Like I said, it has all the resources I talked about today, some extra ones that just couldn't fit in. It also has my entire slide deck and speaking notes, which you can download and play with as you need to. Suzanne asks if my resource list includes affordable software. So not as much on that. The site that it's going to take you to, that biancawoods.weebly.com, I have all of my different talks on there. If you go to the parent site of that, I actually have some talks on free tools or inexpensive tools for doing visual designs and multimedia design. So seriously, go check that out. And if you want just to have a direct link to that, just send me an email or shoot me up a message on Twitter, because oh boy, do I have resources for you. I have someone asking what programs I recommend to create these designs. Tons. I will say this. I have a multimedia design background. I fall back on PowerPoint all the time just because it's on my computer. It's easy to learn how to use, and it's weirdly flexible. Like, you can actually make animated videos in PowerPoint. If everyone ever wants to know how to do that, please hit me up. I will teach you because it's simple. I do graphics in there. You can do simple editing of photos. I use a lot of apps as well on my phone. I do a lot of photography, a lot of videography, leveraging my phone just because it's so fast. So iMovie on my phone is weirdly good. There are some really good design apps too. I just started using something called Affinity Designer, and it is an Illustrator alternative, but it's way, way cheaper. It's about $50 US, and it's available as an app version for the iPad as well as for your desktop. I have both because I'm that kind of nerd. It's pretty great. And Suzanne asked if my resource list includes affordable software. Yes, so I believe 2 of the presentations I have on that site are all about cheap and free design tools. I'm really big, like I mentioned, into leveraging apps too, and apps are very, very cheap. Trying to see if I missed any questions on here. And my lovely host, if you happen to catch any questions that I missed during the talk, let me know. Michelle, I'm so sorry about those hills. We're never going to not think about memories now when we look at whatever hills you create. The Pinterest name of the board that I made, it's in the resource link. So you can check that out there. And that's got a ton of free assets for you guys to play with.
Yeah, Bianca, I don't see any other questions that you haven't already covered. So, yeah. And we are at time. So I think, as you can see, everybody's thanking you. And I want to also extend hearty thank you for a great presentation. Love to maybe have you back again for some other events. So I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Well, thank all of you for taking time out for what most of you was your lunch period and spending the time with me.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Bianca.
With that, I will bid everyone have a great day, and you as well, Bianca. And next month, it will be the second Tuesday of the month. We'll reconvene for another exciting e-learning SIG. Thanks, everybody.